been described as the most serious espionage scandal ever uncovered in Greece. A senior Air Force officer is accused of spying for China and leaking highly classified military and NATO intelligence. So, where does this leave Greek and NATO security? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, a 54-year-old colonel in the Greek Air Force is facing life behind bars if found guilty of charges which include transmitting top-secret military information to China. The arrest follows a tip-off from the US intelligence agency, with the suspect believed to have been trying to recruit others.
Ushered out by military guards and into a waiting vehicle, remanded in custody until his trial. 54-year-old Christos Flessas, a colonel for the Greek Air Force, faces life in prison if convicted of passing NATO secrets to China. His lawyer argues that Flessas initially believed he was spying for a Chinese company rather than intelligence services.
He's admitted to some of the facts according to what actually happened. He considered from the outset that the transaction had not been carried out with a state body, but with a private company.
According to reports in Greek media, Flessas admitted to photographing and transmitting classified NATO files using specialised encryption software.
When nations do this, it's because they expect to or they're preparing to go to war. They are securing themselves, they're doing the best they can, China's doing the best it can to protect itself in the event of war. That's what makes this case sort of significant and a little threatening.
There has so far been no official response or comment from China regarding these allegations. Greek authorities were alerted about the military leak by US intelligence services, and there are fears other military officials are involved. In a separate case, arrests have also been made in France, with 2 Chinese nationals charged with delivering information to a foreign power. Beijing claims the accusations are a smear campaign against China. In Greece, there is shock that such a high-ranking officer could be accused of passing sensitive information to China, as it works with NATO to tighten its security and counter espionage measures.
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining me here in the studio, we have Sean Bell. He's a military analyst and a retired British Air Vice Marshal. Isabel Hilton is founder of the China Dialogue Trust. In Athens, we have the broadcast journalist Iona Sakoufakis. And in Brussels, we have Paul King. He is former editor of NATO Review. You're all very welcome to this roundtable. Iona, I'll come to you first of all. Just give us an indication of how shocked people in Greece are and maybe a bit embarrassed by what has happened here.
Well, so far, there's no widespread panic. Maybe the people are shocked. The issue that's been discussed more, it's in political and defense circles than in everyday public discourse. I think people do not know what to make out of this because they're not really aware of what this can mean for the country. Nobody actually knows how damage this individual has actually done to the country and what kind of information he passed to his so-called handler. But there's a possibility that this individual might be stripped of his nationality. And that's a bit shocking because this would be a first for Greece. But I have to tell you that this actually opens a window for him to be actually extradited as a stateless person. Very, very rare for Greece. But they're still waiting to see what comes next. What are the next steps? Because people don't really know what this means for the country.
Well, let's ask Paul that question. Paul, just how sensitive is this for the Greek authorities now?
Well, I think it's sensitive for any country that has this happen to personnel from their country. But I wouldn't look too much, particularly at Greece. There have been arrests in France for similar Chinese spying and espionage activities in recent days. We've seen in Germany with AfD that there was some spying there. So I think it's basically something that we're going to have to get used to. It's the new normal. Certainly, whilst I was at HQ, the Russian threat of spying was enormous and well understood. The Chinese were more adept at, should we say, industrial IP theft and more by cyber rather than in person. So this does mark a change, and I think we're going to have to get used to this happening even more.
Thank you, Paul. Isabel, to you, there are reports that what they were after were the armed forces technologies under development. Is that something that would really be of interest to China, what NATO countries are using in the air and going to use?
Absolutely, it would be interesting to China and to China's best friend Russia. And don't forget that 2 Chinese nationals were arrested in Kyiv in July last year, and they were taking a very keen interest in the Ukrainian missile that had sunk the Black Sea Fleet. So there is a very close relationship there. They spy on each other, but they also both spy on us. And you can't assume that what the Chinese gather from their espionage stays in China. I think that we have to have a presumption that it's certainly possible that much of it is shared with Russia.
And how concerning is that then, that you have sharing of intel that has been pilfered, basically plundered from other places?
Well, it's extremely concerning, particularly when it's NATO countries. I mean, after all, we are effectively at war with Russia. We have Russian sabotage going on across Europe. We have Russian espionage. But if you add the capacity of the Chinese to spy is on a quite enormous scale. Yes, indeed, as our own security services keep reminding every institution in the country now that the scale of Chinese influence peddling and espionage is really, it's unprecedented, simply because they have 500,000 people to do it. And they have now technological capacity to penetrate systems that they didn't have before.
Well, obviously, China deny any wrongdoing. Sean, just come in on your take on how damaging this could be for NATO then.
Well, I think there's a couple of issues here, one of which is, in warfighting terms, the West technology has always been our asymmetric advantage. It's always been the way that we, ever since World War II, 70 million people died. We don't want to get dragged into wars of attrition. Therefore, surgical strike and technology offers us a different answer. I think if you don't have that advantage in technology, you get dragged into what Ukraine's getting dragged in at the moment, which is a grueling war of attrition. That is not what the West wants to get involved in. And I think there's always been spying. These things have always happened. It's not the first time that Greece has let the secret slip. 1987, there was a case where some secrets were handed over to the former Soviet Union, and some Stinger missiles and Harpoon missiles were copied. I think the second issue, though, which for me is also very worrying, is the timing of this. You've got currently America looking as if it's backpedaling slightly from NATO, and this just undermines the security of NATO. I understand it was top secret information that was let go. America will not want to share its secrets with NATO if it believes that the NATO organization is porous. I'm old enough and ugly enough and served enough to know that NATO only operates to its lowest common denominator, but this will add further fuel to President Trump's view that NATO is really not to be trusted.
Thank you, Sean. Iona, to you, how do people in Greece feel hearing that your country is being viewed as a weak link in NATO because of this?
Well, I think in many ways Greece is seen less on a weak link in the NATO, but more as a pressure point, strategically, essentially, but constantly tested. So I think the Greek people already know that we are one of the smallest countries, and maybe we could be a weak link. I think we've come to terms with that.
And tell me, Iona, is there pressure in Greece now for people to kind of step up, perhaps more investment in vetting and screening of people who have access to very sensitive material?
Oh, well, Greece already spends a relatively high percentage of its GDP on defense compared to most EU countries, often above NATO's 2% target. But I think a large share of the budget goes to procurement, like fighter jets, Rafale aircrafts, and less attention is paid, historically goes to intelligence reform, cyber defense, and counterintelligence modernization. So I think the issue here is not necessarily spending more, but spending smarter, meaning that it can invest some of that budget in strengthening, like you said, internal vetting systems, cybersecurity infrastructure, improving personal monitoring systems, upgrading counterintelligence training, things like that. Not necessarily so spending more, but spending smarter.
Paul, what do you think the motive was here? Was it financial, ideological, someone who was disgruntled? I know it is a very serious allegation. What do you think was driving this man on to allegedly do what he did?
Well, I think we know because we've heard enough about the case. I remember talking to the counter-espionage people in HQ, and the word is nice that sums the motivations up, which is N for nationalism, I for ideology, C for cash, and E for ego. This is clearly cash. It's surprising because he's a colonel, so it's certainly not ego. He's already an important enough person. It's also surprising because it was for relatively small amounts of money, as little as 5,000 for each piece of information. And why that's worrying is that you have somebody who's quite high up the food chain who's doing this, uh, doing it for quite little. And most worryingly of all, perhaps, is that he was actually caught trying to recruit as well. So I think the takeaway from this is that this one has been caught, but how many other kind of situations around the alliance could this be happening in?
Thank you. Just, Isabel, on that point, how worrying is that then, that if there are others, if he was trying to recruit people that will presumably be very scared now?
Well, indeed, and again, that's a bit of a pattern. It's one of the things you do if you're bent on espionage. I find it quite interesting that I think that it would have to be ideology if it was Russia, because we know that Russia is an enemy. But with China, there's quite an ambivalent view in many countries about whether China is a hostile power or not. And I remember China was, a big important factor when Greece was in its financial crisis. China came in with investment at a time when certainly I think Greeks felt that other countries weren't stepping up. And there may well be a perception that China is really okay. And I think if that's the case, then we really need to revise it quite quickly, because we cannot assume China's intent is benign at all.
And Isabel, the sums of money that Paul just mentioned, 5,000 here, 5,000 there, for the Chinese, this is chicken feed.
It's absolutely nothing. I mean, I can't think why anyone who had a relatively successful career would risk his entire reputation and his liberty for £5,000 a time. It's ridiculous. But that argues that there was at least a certain sympathy for the project.
Sean, just talk to me about how an approach would even be made, or how a nation state would go about tapping up someone, for want of a better phrase.
Sounds like I've got experience in it.
Well, I mean, you've served at the highest level.
Yeah,
You see these things coming a mile off.
Yeah, but so there's a couple of things in context. We're looking at this almost like an isolated case. I think there's a real danger in that. Spying is very widespread. It's done on an industrial scale, whether it's at universities, whether it's in the industrial state, political state, or the military state. So you have to ask your question of why is this particular one come to light? We understand that it was a prompt by the American CIA that prompted it. Are there political reasons for that? Actually, several times when I was in the military, you're aware of people who are questionable and you monitor them, particularly wartime. You can actually use them to feed false information and actually learn a lot about the people behind the scenes, their network and the like. You don't generally run around and pick them up straight away. So we're never going to know the full story behind this. It's worrying as a headline. I think the point is that we've got complacent in the West, 35 years of peace dividend. Actually, we've got a wake-up call here. And also, if the United States of Europe is to, as Macron been saying, needs to get a credible military capability, we're going to have to be much more careful about how we share secrets.
Thanks, Sean. Iana, back to you. Just tell us a little bit about how the Greek authorities realised they had a problem. There were some reports that they were tipped off by a foreign intelligence agency. Other people are saying that this guy had actually flown to China, and that was what flagged it so obviously.
Yes, he was actually monitored for 8 months. So it's not really known for how long he was operating. And this is actually what's worrying here, because he might be working for that handler for a long time. But We don't know exactly when the authorities knew something was going on. But after these 8 months, last year in 2025, he had a meeting, he flew to China, and this is exactly what tipped the authorities off. And this is how they knew something was going on. Of course, they found a phone that was not registered, and this is where they found these classified documents.
Paul, to you, any organisation is only as strong as its weakest link. Talk to me about countermeasures that countries may be putting in place and clearly already have in place to stop this kind of thing.
Well, I think there's two things here. The first is that that's a national prerogative, and so you're really only as good as your intelligence services. And they vary in quality around the alliance. But the second thing is that if this is proved to be a CIA tip-off, and it seems that that basically is part of the story, then it does reinforce the fact that when it comes to European capabilities, particularly in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, we are still reliant on the US, even to learn about what's going on in our backyard. And so that comes back to what Mark Rutte was saying recently, which is that the Europeans can dream of operating on their own, but at the moment that is only a dream, and this case highlights that.
Thanks, Paul. Isabel, that's quite a fascinating point, isn't it? That as much as people in Europe think that they're strong, we can do without the Americans, this was happening in Greece's backyard and they only found out about it because of the CIA.
Well, I think that the dependence on the United States, particularly for intelligence, is a well-established fact. Not just intelligence, frankly. I mean, the kit that people fight with is American, or a lot of it is. The United States of Europe is quite a long way off in terms of, and certainly in terms of defense. And, that was really what NATO was for. Rather, Europe was built along other lines. It was built, to facilitate trade. It was built to reduce tensions between nations and to bind countries together with common rules. It wasn't built as a kind of strategic actor. It wasn't built as a defense actor. So there's quite a long way to go still, I think, before this rupture with the United States can be translated into effective action in Europe. It's going to take time.
Sean, what will other members of NATO be thinking privately about this? Will they be saying, thank God this isn't us, or will they just be saying we could have predicted it would be this country?
It's be fair to say that many of my colleagues in the military are profoundly worried about, we live in a connected world. I was going to a military base the other day, and colleagues were talking about how do you allow an electric car like Tesla onto the base? Because all these electric cars are networked back to the mothership. Could they be hoovering up information whilst they're here? The advent of technology is asking us to ask some very, very different questions. Ayana alluded to this sort of special machine that China had given. It was almost certainly a mobile phone, but had a very different software that allowed it to send encrypted messages away. I think the one protection that most of my military colleagues would say is that secrets are generally on a need-to-know basis. National secrets stay national. NATO has a level of secrecy leveled up, but it's not the same. There's a general acceptance that some levels of NATO might be more porous than others, and therefore it's used very, very cautiously in real life.
Just going back to the money side of things and why someone would have done this, what rush would he have been getting out of considerably small amounts of money in terms of the risk to reputation, his freedom, and even now his Greek citizenship?
I can't speak for him, but I can speak for my military colleagues. They generally aren't the highest paid people in the world, and generally over the last 30 years, they put their lives on the line. They've been stood on the wall, standing in the defense of our nations. And the last thing they'd want to do is betray their country in any way. They are massive teamwork, massive pride, massive courage along the way. So I think our military colleagues would view this in very, very unfavorable terms, because it's the complete antithesis of the very binding mechanism, the camaraderie, the loyalty that forms an essential part of our armed forces.
And Isabel, that will hurt people who worked with this guy, who will have trusted him.
Of course, it's a betrayal of the man next to you, to whom you owe your highest loyalty in the military. But just to Sean's point about Teslas, in China, you're not allowed to drive a Tesla onto a military base because the Chinese know very well what a Tesla can do. And the most astonishing deal that the British Ministry of Defense did recently was to lease a large number of Chinese brand electric vehicles. And then they have to tell people driving them not to have their mobile phones inside and not to speak. So we're not very joined up in our perceptions of risk right now.
It's absolutely fascinating. Iona, to you, just talk us through what happens next now in terms of the kernel. Where is it at legally and criminally in the courts?
Yesterday there was a hearing. He was there for about 8 hours. His defense system was actually claiming that when he was recruited, he didn't know what he was getting himself into. They are trying to play that card right now. But what is really widely discussed here is the nationality, the Greek citizenship issue that the Greek authorities might actually do that. And this is really rare for Greece, but we will know that very soon in some days, I think.
Thank you. Paul, I just want to touch upon what happens now with Greece and NATO. I mean, will they be regarded with suspicion in terms of intelligence sharing by others, or will this be quickly papered over and everyone will move on?
I think Sean has already said that the NATO is porous in certain areas. There are certain countries I could name, but I'm not going to, who were and sometimes are still suspected of being sources of leaks. So it isn't a homogenous organization in that sense. I don't think there's going to be too much finger pointing at Greece, because, as I say, there are other countries who've experienced this, and that's on the covert side. On the overt side, you have Hungary buying Russian fossil fuels, for example. So it's not as though, and Slovakia, who is a country that's never really been fully in favor, or very high levels of favor of being in NATO. So it's not as he who's without sin can cast the first stone, and I think most NATO members recognize that they have their own problems. In terms of going forward together, I would say the challenge is from the Chinese, and that's what NATO calls China. Russia is a threat. China is a challenge. And I think the challenge there is that this was looking at areas such as satellite technology. It was looking at communications technology. And when you think about their interest in areas like the Arctic as well, then we're really looking at a global approach. Some people would say that it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization dealing with the North Atlantic, and China is most interested in the South China Sea. But in reality, what this is the collision of interests, which by their very definition are global. And here we can see that the Chinese are taking this interest globally.
Thank you. Isabel, you have unbelievable knowledge of China. Do you think it's possible for a NATO country to be as successful in terms of espionage in China and seeing what they're up to, what they're developing? I mean, does it work both ways?
With some difficulty, I would say. I mean, for one thing, open societies are much easier to penetrate than closed societies, and just the scale of the Chinese operation is highly significant. And I think that we've probably become accustomed to think of China as lagging in technological terms. But recent studies say that of 7 key technologies, China's probably ahead in 6 of them by now. So that's a serious advantage, and that is certainly being deployed in strategic areas and in espionage in military areas. So I think it would be very difficult.
And Sean, how watertight, with your experience of the UK, how watertight do you think the UK military is? What level of shock would you have if a guy serving beside you in the British Armed Forces was suddenly arrested and accused of what this man is being accused of?
Well, to be honest, I don't think he'll get as far as an arrest, because I think his colleagues would probably take him outside and deal with it summarily, to be brutally honest. But picking up, Nick, I do think there's a profound question here about the suitability of NATO. What we're looking at, United Nations, International Criminal Court, a lot of these organizations were formed 7, 8 decades ago for a particular set of circumstances. If we're looking at the world today, particularly with America saying, we'll look after the Western Hemisphere, China look after the Eastern Hemisphere, Russia and the Europeans, you fight for Middle Earth. would we invent NATO today? And I do wonder whether we're starting to wake up to the fact that NATO had its uses, was fantastic. Doesn't mean you get rid of it, but is that the right security environment for the future going forward? And I think this is only going to raise those questions even higher.
Sean, that issue of citizenship being stripped, and Iona hinted that this man could be extradited anywhere now. Who perhaps might be interested in speaking to him?
There'll be lots of people. But I think here you're trying to say, are you setting the example, or actually extraditing him might actually take away a font of information that might actually materialize over some time. Generally speaking, the security services want to spend quite a lot of time with an individual like that to scrape away the layers of what he knew, who he was talking to, who his contacts were. And it might well have been that actually, as Ilana said earlier, he's been observed for 6 to 8 months. It might well have been that they were tracking everything he did, everybody he spoke to, long before this all became public, because that's the way you get to the bottom of the networks. And actually, rather than dealing with a symptom, you deal with a disease.
Paul, Iona, Isabel, and Sean, thank you all so much. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.